At 9:16 that morning, I signed away 27 years of marriage. At 9:52, a woman I had never met stood on my porch holding warm bread and asked when I had last eaten. I remember those times because the divorce papers were still on my kitchen table when she knocked. My wedding ring sat beside them, leaving a pale circle around my finger that looked strangely intimate now that it meant nothing legally. I was 54 years old, living in a rented cottage outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire, surrounded by boxes labeled with rooms from a house that was no longer mine. The November sky was the color of wet concrete. I had spent the drive home telling myself I felt relieved. Then I stepped inside and realized relief could sound exactly like an empty refrigerator humming in an empty kitchen. I had just filled the kettle when someone knocked. I almost ignored it. Nobody knew me here except the property manager, and I had chosen this neighborhood partly because nobody would. The second knock was softer. I opened the door. The woman on my porch had chestnut hair pulled loosely behind her head, flour dusted across one sleeve of her navy sweater, and a loaf wrapped in a white cotton towel resting between her hands. Steam carried the scent of toasted grain and rosemary into the cold air. "Hi," she said. "I am Becca Hayes. I own the bakery down the street. Mrs. Callahan said someone new had moved into this cottage, so I brought you this." I looked at the bread as if she had handed me something far more complicated. "That is incredibly kind. It is also still hot, so do not put it in plastic unless you enjoy disappointing bakers." I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound startled me. Becca smiled, but her eyes moved past my shoulder for only a second. The papers were visible on the table. So was the ring. She did not ask about either one. Instead, she looked back at me and said, "Have you eaten today?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Breakfast had been coffee in my attorney's office. Lunch had not happened. 4 years I had remembered David's cholesterol medication, his preferred brand of mustard, his mother's birthday, which shirts needed dry cleaning, and whether we had enough coffee for Sunday morning. Yet standing there, I could not remember the last actual meal I had made for myself. "I do not think so," I admitted. Becca shifted the loaf toward me. "Then start with this." I took it. The towel was warm against my palms. "Thank you." "You are welcome, Laura." She stepped backward, then pointed toward the end of the street. "Hayes Bakery. Green awning. If the bread is terrible, you know where to complain. And if it is good, then you can lie and say it changed your life." I smiled again. She walked away before I could think of another reason to keep her there. Inside, I tore off a piece of bread with my hands. The crust cracked softly. Butter melted into the center almost immediately. I ate standing at the counter while rain began tapping against the windows. Halfway through the second piece, tears came without warning. Not because I missed my marriage. That would have been easier to understand. I cried because a stranger had asked whether I had eaten, and I suddenly realized how long it had been since anyone, including me, had wondered what I needed. The next morning, I woke before 6 because the cottage had not yet learned my sounds. Every creak felt unfamiliar. Every passing car made light move across the bedroom ceiling. For 27 years, mornings had followed a script. David showered first. I made coffee. He read the news while I checked the calendar. Now there was no script, only a cold floor beneath my feet and half a loaf of rosemary bread on the counter. I toasted 2 slices and ate both. That felt oddly rebellious. Around 10, I folded the white cotton towel Becca had used and walked toward the bakery. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the sidewalks dark and shining. Hayes Bakery sat 3 blocks away beneath a green awning, its front windows fogged from the warmth inside. When I opened the door, a bell chimed above me. Coffee, cinnamon butter, and warm yeast filled the air. Becca stood behind the counter handing a paper bag to an older man. She looked up and recognized me immediately. "You survived the bread." "Barely." I placed the folded towel on the counter. "I came to return this." She glanced at it. "You walked 3 blocks in 40-degree weather to return a towel worth about $4? I hesitated. "Apparently." Becca smiled. "Coffee?" I looked at the menu. "Black," she said before I answered. "Is there daher?" "You remember? You looked like someone who would consider cream an unnecessary negotiation." I laughed. She poured a cup and slid it toward me. I reached for my wallet. "First one is on the house." Yesterday was on the house. Yesterday was emergency bread. Different department. I carried the coffee to a small table near the window. For the first time since moving, I sat somewhere without feeling pressure to unpack, organize, sign, cancel, or explain anything. I watched Becca work. She knew customers by name. She asked one woman about her son's college application and reminded another man that his wife preferred the seeded rye. Then I noticed something. Whenever a loaf came from the kitchen with an uneven crust or a dark edge, Becca placed it on a shelf behind the counter. Around noon, she tore a piece from one and ate it standing beside the register. "You keep the imperfect ones," I said when the rush faded. She looked at the bread in her hand. "Occupational hazard. Why not take one of the good ones? Those are for customers." She said it casually, but something about the answer caught inside me. Becca studied my face. "What?" "Nothing." She leaned against the counter. That was definitely something. I looked into my coffee. I spent most of my marriage doing that. Doing what? Giving away the good part first. Her expression changed, losing its teasing edge. "Did anyone ask you to?" The question landed harder than I expected. I thought of David. He had never ordered me to surrender anything. There had been no single dramatic moment when I disappeared. Just hundreds of sensible choices. His schedule mattered more because his job was demanding. His preferences were easier because I hated conflict. My work became flexible because somebody needed to be. "I do not know," I said quietly. Becca nodded as if she understood that this was not an answer I could produce over coffee. She picked up the imperfect loaf, cut a thick slice from its best side, spread butter across it, and placed it in front of me. "Then maybe you should practice," she said. "Practice what?" "Keeping the good part." I looked at her, then at the bread. For reasons I could not explain, I took the first bite without offering half back. 3 days later, I finally opened the box marked office, although nothing inside it belonged to the life I was living anymore. There were tax folders, old notebooks, 2 dried-out pens, and a stack of magazines tied with kitchen twine. I almost carried the whole thing to the recycling bin. Then I saw my own name. Laura Mitchell, food stylist. The magazine was 18 years old. On the cover was a Sunday breakfast table I had built from almost nothing. Chipped blue plates, strawberries scattered beside warm biscuits, honey catching the morning light. I remembered driving 40 miles to find those plates because the editor wanted something that felt inherited rather than purchased. I remembered loving that kind of problem. I sat on the floor with the magazine across my knees until a knock interrupted me. Becca stood outside with a small paper bag. "Before you accuse me of excessive neighborliness," she said, "these are yesterday's cranberry scones. I cannot sell them, and I refuse to eat 6. I stepped aside. "Come in." She entered, brushing cold air from her coat, then noticed the magazine on the floor. Her expression changed so quickly I almost missed it. "You did this?" she asked. "A long time ago." Becca crouched beside the magazine. "This is beautiful. It is breakfast." "No." She pointed to the photograph. "It feels like somebody just stood up from the table and might come back." I looked at her. That was exactly what I had tried to create. Nobody had described my work that way in years. Becca glanced around at the unopened boxes. "Do you still do this?" "Not really." "Why?" I gave the answer I had practiced for more than a decade. "Life got busy." She waited. Somehow her silence made the sentence sound as thin as it was. David's career became demanding. We moved twice. My mother got sick. Clients wanted travel. I started turning things down because staying close to home was easier. After a while, people stopped calling. Becca sat on the edge of the couch. "Did you want to stop?" I looked toward the window. I could hear a truck passing on the wet street outside. I do not remember deciding to. "That is not the same thing." "No," I said. "It was not." She picked up another magazine. "What did you stop wanting because asking felt selfish?" The question struck somewhere deeper than I expected. I wanted to answer quickly, but nothing honest came quickly. I thought about weekends I had canceled, assignments I had declined, restaurants I had wanted to try, cities I had wanted to photograph. I thought about how often I had said, "It does not matter," until eventually I believed myself. "I do not know," I whispered. Becca nodded. "Maybe that is where you start." After she left, I stood in the spare bedroom staring at a closet I had barely opened. Behind 2 winter coats was a black camera bag. My old digital camera was inside. along with 3 lenses and a faded strap. I charged the battery, cleaned the lens, and carried it into the kitchen. First I felt ridiculous. Then afternoon light fell across the remaining piece of rosemary bread on a blue plate. I moved the plate 6 inches toward the window, then 2 inches back. I folded the towel beneath it. My hands knew what to do before my mind did. I looked through the viewfinder and pressed the shutter. The small click filled the cottage. I took another photograph, then another. By the 10th I was standing differently, breathing differently. I caught my reflection in the dark window, camera raised to my face, and for one startled second I recognized the woman looking back. For mornings after I took that first photograph, the cottage woke me with the sound of dripping water. First I thought it was rain. Then something cold touched my bare foot beside the bed. I turned on the lamp and found a thin stream creeping from the hallway toward the bedroom rug. A pipe beneath the upstairs bathroom sink had failed. By 7, Mrs. Callahan had sent a plumber, and by 8, part of the ceiling below the bathroom was open, the water was shut off, and 2 industrial fans were humming like small airplanes. The plumber estimated 3 or 4 days before everything would be dry and usable again. Mrs. Callahan offered to pay for a hotel. I told her I would think about it. What I actually did was walk to Hayes Bakery because coffee seemed easier than making decisions. Becca looked up from the counter and immediately frowned. You look like you lost an argument with your house. My house won. I explained what happened. She handed me coffee before I finished. Where are you staying? Probably a hotel. Probably. I have not booked one yet. Becca wiped her hands on her apron. There is a guest room above the bakery.
Ist daher?
Absolutely not. That was quick. Because you barely know me. I know you drink black coffee, return inexpensive towels, and photograph bread when nobody is watching. That is enough information for 3 nights. I laughed, but she did not. Laura, you need running water. I have an empty room. You do not owe me anything for using it. The words landed somewhere tender. I had spent so many years measuring favors, balancing obligations, making sure I never needed more than I gave. Accepting kindness without repayment felt almost irresponsible. Becca seemed to read the argument happening behind my eyes. You can say yes without turning it into a debt. I looked at her. You make that sound easy. It gets easier with practice. By late afternoon, my suitcase was sitting beside a narrow bed in the apartment above the bakery. The room had white walls, a blue quilt, and 1 window facing the street. Downstairs I could hear the muted rhythm of trays being moved and doors closing. Becca had left clean towels on the dresser and cleared half a shelf in the bathroom. Nothing about it felt romantic. That somehow made my awareness of her more unsettling. At 4:30 the next morning, a low vibration beneath the floor woke me. I pulled on a sweater and followed the smell of coffee downstairs. Becca stood in the bakery kitchen beneath warm pendant lights, her hair loosely tied back, flour streaked across her cheek. You are awake, she said. Your building is needing something. She smiled. Come here. I watched her fold dough across a wooden work table. Outside, Portsmouth was still dark. Inside, everything smelled like yeast, coffee, and toasted grain. My camera was upstairs. I found myself wishing it were in my hands. Becca noticed me staring. What? Nothing. That is rarely true with you. I hesitated, then went upstairs for the camera. When I returned, she did not pose. She simply worked. Fold. Turn. Flour. Light. Through the viewfinder, I watched the first blue edge of dawn appear behind her. I pressed the shutter. Becca looked up at the sound. For one suspended second, our eyes met through the lens, and I forgot completely about bread. By the second morning above the bakery, I had learned that Becca talked to dough when she thought nobody was listening. Easy, she murmured while turning a stubborn batch across the table. You have plenty of time. I stood near the coffee machine with my camera hanging from my shoulder. Are you talking to breakfast? She glanced at me. Bread responds better than people. That explains several things about you. She laughed, and the sound warmed the room more effectively than the ovens. After closing that evening, Becca placed a clean apron in front of me. Your turn. My turn for what? You have photographed enough bread. Now you make some. I tied the apron around my waist and followed her instructions. Flour. Water.
Starter.
Salt. My first attempt became a sticky disaster across my fingers. Becca watched me attack the dough with increasing frustration. Stop fighting it. I am not fighting it. Laura, you look personally offended by gluten. I laughed despite myself. She stepped beside me and gently adjusted my hands. Fold, do not crush. Her fingers rested over mine for only a moment, but every thought in my head scattered. I became aware of the warmth of her shoulder beside mine, the flower on her wrist, the faint scent of coffee in her sweater. She stepped away first. Better, she said quietly. I looked down at the dough because looking at her suddenly felt dangerous. You cannot force it into becoming ready, Becca continued. You give it what it needs, then you let time do something. I smiled faintly. Are we still talking about bread? Her eyes met mine. I am not sure. Silence stretched between us. Somewhere behind the kitchen door, a refrigerator clicked on. Becca leaned against the table. What are you hungry for, Laura? I looked toward the racks of cooling loaves. That seems like an unfair question in a bakery. You know what I mean. I did. That was the problem. Weeks earlier I would have answered peace. Maybe stability. Something respectable and vague. Now I thought about my camera. The cottage. Driving somewhere without checking another person's schedule. Ordering exactly what I wanted. Waking before sunrise because I wanted to photograph a woman making bread. A life I actually chose, I said. Becca did not smile. She simply looked at me with an expression so open that I felt exposed in the gentlest possible way. Then choose something, she said. Right now. Something small. Something honest. My heart began beating faster. I could have chosen coffee, music, the loaf cooling between us. Instead, I reached across the work table and took her hand. Becca went still. For 1 second, I nearly pulled away. Then her fingers closed around mine. No one had touched me like that in years, not because the touch was extraordinary, but because I was completely present for it. Her thumb moved once across my knuckles. I swallowed. I have never held a woman's hand and meant it this way. Becca's voice softened. You do not have to know what it means tomorrow. I looked at her. I think I know what it means tonight. Something changed in her face. Not triumph. Not surprise. Tenderness, maybe. She squeezed my hand once and let go before the moment could ask more from either of us. Later, we cut into my first loaf. It was dense, uneven, and slightly underbaked in the middle. Becca chewed thoughtfully. Well, I asked. She reached for butter. I think your photography career is safe. I laughed until my eyes watered. The next afternoon, Mrs. Callahan called to say the cottage was ready. I should have felt relieved. Instead, while packing my suitcase, I caught myself listening for Becca downstairs and realized I had started measuring home by the sound of her footsteps. The cottage felt too quiet after 3 nights above the bakery. I unpacked my suitcase, placed my camera on the kitchen table, and tried to convince myself that missing Becca was simply the after effect of sharing space with another person. By noon I had stopped believing that. The next morning, I returned to Hayes Bakery with the excuse of showing her the photographs I had taken. Becca was upstairs checking invoices, so I waited at the small table near the window. My camera rested beside my coffee. On a shelf behind me sat several cookbooks, recipe binders, and a narrow wooden box with its lid partly open. I would have ignored it if I had not recognized the corner of an old magazine page inside. My photograph. The breakfast table with blue plates, strawberries, biscuits, and honey glowing in morning light. I pulled the clipping free. My name was printed beneath it. Laura Mitchell, food stylist. The room seemed to lose its warmth. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Laura. Becca stopped when she saw what I was holding. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Why do you have this? I asked. Her face changed. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to fear. I can explain. Then explain. Becca came around the counter but kept several feet between us. Mrs. Callahan mentioned your name before you moved into the cottage. She knew I sometimes brought bread to new tenants. When she said Laura Mitchell, I wondered if you were the same woman. The same woman from this? I lifted the clipping. Yes. So you knew who I was when you knocked on my door. I knew your name and your work. That is not the same as knowing you. The distinction did not comfort me. I thought about the bread, the coffee, the questions, the magazine she had studied in my cottage. You acted surprised when you saw my old magazine. Becca looked down. I was surprised you still had it. That is not what you let me believe. I know. Her answer was immediate and somehow that hurt more. Why did you not tell me? At first, because it felt strange to say I remembered your work from years ago. Then we became friends and every day I waited made it harder. Friends. The word felt painfully small after the way her hand had closed around mine. Was the bread even about welcoming a neighbor? Yes. She stepped forward then stopped. Laura, I did not know about your divorce. I did not know what kind of mourning you were having. I did not know I would care about you. But you came because of this. Partly, she admitted. I looked again at the photograph. Something I had made before my life became smaller had somehow reached Becca before I knew she existed. That should have moved me. Instead, all I could feel was how carefully she had kept that truth outside the room while asking me to bring mine inside. You let me tell you things I barely knew how to admit to myself. I know. And you already had a piece of my past in a box. Her eyes shone but her voice remained steady. Yes. I folded the clipping carefully. My hands were trembling. I need to go. Laura, please let me tell you why I kept it. Not now. I picked up my camera. Becca did not follow me when I walked outside. The November air felt sharp against my face. Back at the cottage, I placed the camera on the kitchen table beside the drawer where I had put my wedding ring. For weeks, Becca had made me feel visible. Now I could not stop wondering how much of me she had seen before I ever opened the door. Becca did not call that night. She did not text the next morning either. I told myself I appreciated the space, but by afternoon I had checked my phone often enough to prove otherwise. On the second evening, there was a knock at the cottage door. Becca stood outside with empty hands. No bread. No coffee. No excuse. I almost respected her more for that. I will leave if you want me to, she said. But I need to tell you why I kept that photograph. I stepped aside. She entered and remained near the door. I did not offer her anything. When I was 25, Becca began. I was in culinary school in Boston. I loved baking, but my family thought it was irresponsible. My father wanted me to finish a business degree. I almost listened. Then one afternoon, I found that magazine in a waiting room. Your photograph stopped me. I frowned. It was breakfast. It was more than breakfast to me. The table looked lived in. Warm. Imperfect. Like someone had made ordinary people feel worth waiting for. She looked toward my kitchen table. I tore the page out after asking the receptionist. I kept it above my desk. 2 weeks later, I decided to stay in culinary school. Is det here? You became a baker because of one photograph? No. Becca shook her head. I became a baker because I loved baking. Your photograph reminded me that ordinary things could matter. That was different and somehow more believable. She continued. Years later, I was with a woman named Natalie. We were together 11 years. We thought we would grow old together. Then we realized we had built a life that looked right from the outside but no longer fit either of us. When it ended 4 years ago, I nearly sold the bakery. I found your photograph again while packing. I looked at the table and remembered why I had started. Her voice softened. So I stayed. The room became very still. For weeks, I had believed Becca was returning pieces of me that marriage had worn away. I had never imagined that some younger version of me had once offered something to her without knowing it. Why did you pretend not to know my work? I asked. Because when I saw that magazine in your cottage, I realized you spoke about that woman as if she were gone. I was afraid telling you what the photograph meant to me would make you feel responsible for something you never agreed to carry. And later I was afraid you would think every kind thing I did had an agenda. I looked at her. That is exactly what I thought. I know. She did not defend herself. That mattered. Becca took a slow breath. The bread was because I wanted to meet you. Everything after you opened the door was because I liked you. The honesty landed differently now. I looked toward my camera. I had spent years believing the creative woman I used to be had disappeared without leaving anything behind. Yet something she made had survived in another woman's life. I am still angry, I said. You should be. I am also confused. That makes sense. And I still want to hold your hand. Becca's eyes lifted to mine. Neither of us moved. That is the confusing part, I whispered. No, she said gently. That might be the honest part. She left without asking me to forgive her. After the door closed, I picked up my camera and found the photograph I had taken of her before dawn. For the first time, I understood that Becca had not brought me back to life. She had only held up a light. I was the one who had started walking toward it. 3 days later, David called and asked if I could meet him in Boston to sign the final documents for the sale of our old house. I almost asked the attorney to handle everything, but avoiding David suddenly felt like another way of letting my old life make decisions for me. We met at a quiet coffee shop near Back Bay. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Maybe I did too. He ordered my coffee before I arrived. Black. No sugar. For 27 years that would have felt intimate. Now it felt like remembering the combination to a lock I no longer used. We signed where the yellow tabs told us to sign. Then David noticed my camera beside my chair. "You're taking pictures again?" he asked. "I am." He smiled. "You always loved that." Something inside me tightened. Then why did I stop? David looked genuinely confused. "Laura, I never asked you to stop." I stared through the window at people moving along the sidewalk. I knew he was right, and I hated how much that truth hurt. There had been no villain in my marriage. No single command that made me smaller. There had only been years of choices that seemed reasonable at the time. His work mattered. My work could wait. His plans were fixed. Mine were flexible. Eventually, I became so skilled at accommodating everyone else that I stopped noticing I had disappeared from my own calendar. On the drive back to Portsmouth, I understood something I had been avoiding. I had gone almost directly from being David's wife to imagining what it might mean to belong beside Becca. I cared about her. That was no longer confusing. What frightened me was not the fact that she was a woman. It was the possibility that I might turn love into another place where I forgot myself. That evening I went to the bakery after closing. Becca unlocked the door without asking why I was there. "I need to tell you something," I said. She waited. "I care about you. More than friendship. More than gratitude." Saying it aloud made my hands tremble. But I continued. "And because that is true, I need some time away from you." Pain crossed her face. She did not hide it. "I met David today. Nothing happened. But he made me see something. I do not know who I am when nobody needs me. I do not know whether I want you from freedom or because an empty house scares me." Becca looked down for a moment, then learned the difference. I swallowed. "You are not angry? I am disappointed. That is different." She stepped closer but stopped several feet away. "Do not choose me because you are afraid of being alone, Laura. And do not become someone else just because you think she would be easier for me to love." Tears burned behind my eyes. I nodded. Then Becca said quietly, "Learn to be alone. Just do not confuse alone with invisible." I carried those words home. The first week was difficult. The second became quieter. I cooked meals for one and stopped calling them leftovers. I drove north with my camera and photographed winter beaches until my fingers went numb inside my gloves. I submitted a small photo essay to a New Hampshire arts magazine. I bought curtains because I liked them, not because anyone else approved. I ate breakfast at my own table. Weeks passed. I missed Becca every day, but missing her did not make me disappear. One morning, an email arrived accepting 3 of my photographs for publication. I read it twice, then laughed alone in my kitchen. My first instinct was to run to the bakery. I did not. Instead, I made coffee, sat by the window, and let the happiness belong entirely to me first. That was when I finally understood. I did not need Becca to make my life feel whole. I wanted her because my life was becoming whole, and I wanted to share it with her. The first loaf I ever made without Becca was slightly crooked, darker on one side, and nowhere near good enough to sell. I carried it to Hayes Bakery before sunrise anyway. The streets were quiet, the November cold had deepened into winter, and my breath turned white beneath the streetlights. Through the bakery window, I saw Becca arranging trays behind the counter. She looked up. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she unlocked the door. "Laura." I held up the loaf. "Before you say anything, I know it needs work." Becca stared at it, then at me. "You baked this?" "Alone." "That explains the shape." I laughed and something tight inside me loosened. She let me in. The bakery smelled exactly as I remembered, but I did not. Becca placed my loaf on the counter. "Why are you here?" I took a breath. "Because I know the difference now." Her expression became still. I told her about the photographs accepted for publication, the drives along the coast, the dinners for one, the mornings when silence stopped feeling like rejection. I told her I had learned that loneliness could visit without becoming permanent. Then I looked directly at her. I can go home from here and be okay. I can wake up tomorrow alone and still know who I am. I do not need you to rescue me from an empty house. Becca's eyes softened. Then why did you come? Because I want you in the life I am choosing. Not instead of that life. Inside it. She looked down at my imperfect loaf. You know I cannot promise this will always be easy. Good. I am finished confusing easy with right. A small smile appeared. I stepped closer. I do not want to disappear inside love again. Then do not, she said. And do not let me disappear either. I held out my hand. Becca looked at it for half a second before placing hers in mine. The gesture was familiar now, but I was not the same woman who had first reached across a flower-covered table. This time I was not asking what the touch meant. I was choosing it. Months later, 3 of my photographs hung in the bakery. I returned to food styling slowly, taking projects I wanted and declining the ones I did not. Becca learned to close the bakery on occasional Sundays. Some weekends she stayed at my cottage. Some nights I stayed above the bakery. We did not rush toward sharing an address. We practiced sharing a life without surrendering our own. One photograph became my favorite. 2 hands breaking open a warm loaf over a blue plate, morning light catching the steam between them. Becca hung it near the front door. Sometimes customers asked what it meant. She always smiled and told them it was about breakfast. I knew better. It was about receiving, choosing, staying. I used to think starting over required becoming someone new. It did not. I only had to begin feeding the parts of myself I had left hungry for years. Thank you for spending this time with our story. If it touched something in you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who may need a reminder that life can begin again at any age. Sometimes love does not arrive to complete us. Sometimes it simply meets us at the door after we have finally learned how to come home to ourselves.